I want to spend the first half of the session this evening on the exercise that I assigned the two pieces on the draft. And our purpose is to illustrate, in what I hope will be starkly dramatic terms, by means of two complete opposites on this point, the issue of self-contained writing, which would also apply to speaking. Self-contained writing. You recall we said last time that when you present ideas, you have to delimit, circumscribe your formulations, the specific points that you include and the way you word them, so as not to raise questions that you are unable to deal with or answer. And I was more specific last time. I said questions that directly and legitimately arise out of the material that you cover. If you do raise such questions and then don't deal with them, you simply baffle, confuse, or antagonize your audience. Now this, of course, is easy to say, but there's a certain problem in actually doing it in a particular case, that is, in knowing how to delimit your material. And the problem arises from the fact that all knowledge is interconnected. On the one hand, in your desire to give a strong case for your material, there's a certain aspect of the assignment pulling you to put in more, to cover all the foundations of your argument, all the objections, all the kind of examples that would make it so convincing. And therefore, there's something pushing you to put in more and more. On the other hand, when you get to a certain point, you pass the limit of what can be self-contained in that presentation. So the problem becomes what to put in to give as good a foundation as you can within the limits of the space available to you, and what to leave out, because if you put that in, you spill over into the non-self-contained. You see, it's a balancing or a juggling act. And for this, experience is very, very helpful. You simply find time after time that you either baffle your listeners or you put so little in that they're completely not convinced, and you begin after a while to get the hang of it. But it's also helpful, particularly at the beginning, to do some analysis of other people who have either mastered or flagrantly violated this issue, and you have an example of each this evening. Now let us turn first to Miss Rand's article, or rather the last half of it, the part on the draft in the Wreckage of the Consensus, which I assigned for you to read for this evening. In the edition I have, it's page 226, but in any event, it's the part that begins, "The institution that enables our leaders to indulge in such recklessly irresponsible ventures as the military draft." Now this last half of the article is an excellent example of making something self-contained which could very easily sprawl all over the place and ruin itself. The context, the early part of the article, as I'm sure you must have read it out of curiosity if nothing else, sketches the general anti-ideological state of the mixed economy, the unprincipled deals, the compromises, the gang warfare, and then applies it to the Vietnam War, which was a leading issue at the time, as one example, and then goes right to the draft as another example. Now, I'm not concerned to point out Ms. Rand's outline this evening, but specifically the issue of self-contained writing, what she chooses to say, and how she's able to make it self-intelligible, as against the next presentation that we'll look at this evening. All right, she starts out right away on the bottom of that page, giving the argument against the draft. And what, in a word, is the point that she makes, that is the essence of her argument, her philosophic argument against the draft, which she says straight out. Yes? Well, no, that's much too broad. She's not just that it's immoral, she's more specific than that. It's immoral for a specific reason. What philosophic concept does it violate? Yes? Individual rights, correct, a violation of individual rights. So she pitches her philosophic proof from the beginning on what you could call a political level. That is, the issue of individual rights is the basic philosophic issue behind, in the field of politics, in terms of defending a free economy in a free country. So it's a political issue. She does not begin with the basic standard of morality from which she deduces rights. Does she offer in this article any proof as to why man has rights? No. She says there's a few indications from which you could glean what type of argument she would offer, but she doesn't. She doesn't say, I believe in rights for the following reasons. Man is a rational being, and so on, so and so. Because then she would raise many more complex issues in the draft. She pitches it right in on rights. On what ground? This is self-contained. Thanks to whom? Could she do this in the 17th century? No. At that time, the idea of individual rights would be a revelation. And you could not just plunge in like that. People want to know what you're talking about. But thanks to the Founding Fathers and Locke and the whole tradition of the Enlightenment, in this country, people recognize that. Therefore, that is self-contained and intelligible with a paragraph or so elaboration. Does she begin by saying, to make it crudely obvious what she doesn't do, I'm against the draft because of the law of identity? Obviously not. Does she begin even by saying, I'm against the draft because I'm an advocate of reason? Obviously not. And yet, if you asked her and kept asking why, if you know objectivism, you know eventually she would reach the point of saying her basis for being against the draft is because A is A, reality is real, and reason is man's means of knowledge. But if she started there, she'd have to go through a whole philosophic dissertation, and the speech would, or paper would long be over before she ever got to the draft. All right. From there, she goes, starting this paragraph, the most immoral contradiction is that of the so-called conservatives. Starting that paragraph, I'm going to give you my page numbers, and you translate into yours if you have a different edition. It's 227 in the paperback I'm following, the second paragraph. She goes into a brief paragraph against the conservative and liberal view. Again, does she go attack the liberals and conservatives from the point of view of their philosophic foundations, which you could easily do, and which she has in other papers, the skepticism of the liberals or their Marxist viewpoint, or the conservatives' tie into religion. But if she did, she would lose the discussion of the draft in a whole bunch of other equally or more controversial issues. On what level, then, does she attack the liberals and the conservatives in this context? Yes?
On their ideology.
You say on their ideology, but one specific aspect of their ideology, which, yes, their view of rights, which she's already indicated her view on. In other words, only within the framework of the base she has already laid down. She points out their contradictions. They claim to be for rights. Only then she points out the contradictions of either side. What does she achieve by putting this in here? Why is this not simply irrelevant polemics? You might say, why even raise the issue of liberals and conservatives? Why not just present your own view? Isn't this in itself a distraction? You might ask that. What does it accomplish? Yes? No. You say because they say they're against the draft, but at the time, the conservatives were defending the draft. And there were many liberals who were defending it also. So she's speaking of the conservatives and the liberals who were defending the draft at the time. But what does she accomplish by even going to take into account? I mean, there's no point in refutation as an end in itself. And she doesn't want to raise issues that she can't deal with. So what does she accomplish by taking this attack on it? Yes? Well, you say she's presenting the context in which the draft in our day is being discussed. That's true, but what is the point of that? That would be then, as you formulated, a sociological observation which would interrupt her philosophic flow. No, she accomplishes something philosophical here by way of making her own view clearer. And the main purpose of this is to clarify what she has said. Remember, rights is a long, complex subject. If you want to start from scratch, you'd have to say, what are rights? There's many different theories of rights. The sheer fact that you say I'm for individual rights is a beginning, but that does not by itself make clear your view. Now, one way of making clear your view is to go into a long dissertation with theoretical definitions, which of course is impossible if your main focus is the draft, which is one application. What is another way, briefly, of making your own view clear? Yes. I heard the word somewhere there. Contrast. Set yourself off from a view which is not yours. And in the sheer act of saying, this one paragraph, she says, now remember, when I say rights, I mean rights. Not the type that says, oh, fine for property, but I'm against life, and I'm not the type that calls welfare handouts rights. Therefore, it amounts to, in effect, saying when I say rights, I mean rights in the original American sense, which is a sanction to action based on the value of life. Now, she doesn't go into that theory, but by means of quickly warding off the two sides, she makes her view more convincing, more defined, what it consists of, in a way which is still self-contained, and shows that the opposition to it is contradictory, glaringly so, because they talk about rights while denying the right to life. All right, and then I'm not going to take it at this length all the way through this evening, but just to get us into it, you get the pattern. The next paragraph, she goes into the discussion of rights impose obligations. Now, why mention that at all? What is the value of taking cognizance of that? Yes. Well, you say it would be a common question. In effect, it's a very widespread viewpoint. It's very commonly said by people who advocate the draft when they argue about rights. And you say, well, doesn't man have rights? And they say, yes, but rights impose obligations. So she will get it out of the way right at the beginning so it won't impede the person's understanding. You had a question, yes?
No, I thought that another reason would be that it indicates the moral basis on which he's...
You're anticipating me, yes. You say you thought it also helps to indicate the moral basis. If you stress the word indicate, it doesn't state, but it suggests. Because observe, how does she refute this theory? Now, in fact, this theory that rights impose obligations actually is a version of what ethics? You know, it's a version of altruism. A man owes his life to society, to others, so on, that they give him certain permissions, certain privileges to be free and so on, so long as he serves them. Now, if she were at this point to say, this bromide, rights impose obligations, comes from the theory of altruism and go off, that finishes then the discussion of the draft, because it's much more controversial, much more complex, it's out. What does she do? She covers this on the level that she's already discussed only, namely rights. Now, she's counting here that people know the difference between a right and a gift. And even if a person hadn't thought of it, as soon as you say to him, this is yours by right as opposed to by gift or permission, the person sees. So she immediately simply says rights impose obligations would mean we don't have rights, it's a gift. And it would mean, therefore, you've rejected the whole idea of man's rights. Now, of course, if she wanted at this point to do a different article, she could go right into, this is why you can't have freedom without an ethics of egoism, and then go into a discussion of that, but then that would be different. She would not be then doing the draft, so she doesn't, but she has laid the base or indicated enough to answer this without having to go into questions which there would be no way of covering and which the audience doesn't need. You know the story, I'm sure you know, an old joke about the little boy who asks his mother where he comes from, and she gives him, you know, this is the moment that she's been waiting for, and she gives him the whole story about the womb and the egg and the whole business. And at the end he said, oh, Billy came from Chicago. And I just wondered where I came from. Well, this is relevant to your audience. A lot of people writing at the beginning think, whoa, I've got rights impose obligations, that's altruism. Now I've got to tell them the whole story, in effect, of where it comes from and why it's evil and so on. But in fact, you don't. This is simply a case of saying the equivalent of Chicago, that is, putting it in terms that a person can understand without making a song and dance where none is necessary. Now, I hope you don't draw from this the conclusion that you should always avoid major philosophic issues. That would be a very mistaken conclusion to draw from what I'm saying. The point is only how to deal with them in contexts where you cannot discuss them at length. Now, we can jump over. She makes some points here. She makes the point that the draft is unconstitutional. We can pass by that. She then goes to the question of the need of volunteers. Generally speaking, why is it necessary for her at this point, or at least at some point, to go into the role of volunteers and of a volunteer army? What would be lacking in this article if she omitted any reference to that? I'll take somebody at the back there? Yes.
Because then there'll be no army. There has to be some kind of army defense.
No, but thinking of, you're saying because then there'll be no army. I mean, if there's no draft and no volunteers, but thinking from the aspect of how this would be read, what question would be on her mind, on the audience's mind, is the question that you just raised. But I'd like you to formulate it as the listener would be thinking, well, if there's no draft, what's going to defend the country then? How will the country be defended? Now, you cannot have a cavalier attitude of saying, in effect, well, I proved that the draft is immoral. So if that's sufficient, if the listener is left wondering, but will the country be able to survive? That's tough. I've shown him the moral basis, and I'm not concerned with, vulgar details such as the survival of the nation. Therefore, if you give a moral point, which you know is going to raise questions of its practicality, it is up to you at least to indicate that it would work out practically. Now, if you have no space, that you can cover very briefly. Enough simply to know you know this issue exists. If you had, for instance, no space at all, you could say, as far as practicality, all history testifies to the practicality of volunteers, period, without saying any more. Now, of course, you haven't proved it, but you've indicated you're aware of that issue, and if people are interested in pursuing your viewpoint, there would be a further answer. Now, here, Ms. Rand goes into greater detail. She discusses why a man would volunteer to fight, and she even answers then on the next page, 228, the question, but what if people don't? And she gives the two reasons, which I won't repeat, why they wouldn't, and concludes neither of those are relevant in a free country, and ends up by showing, therefore, that the draft is practical, not only moral, but practical, the non-draft is practical, in the sense that it prevents an adventurous foreign policy on the part of the government that the citizens don't see the value of, and also she goes on to make the other practical point about the modern warfare being technological and needing, therefore, trained military. In general, it's always valuable to include an indication of the moral and the practical where these issues come up. If you include only the moral, you will leave the implication of you're a theoretician in the clouds without concern for reality. If you include only the practical, even suppose you show, yes, it has worked, the immediate question in your reader's mind is what? Why has it worked? Why must it work? Is there any theoretical basis, or is it just that up to now a volunteer army has worked, but in the future it wouldn't? The union of the two gives the theory and the practice, the reason why it has to, and then the proof that it has. And the combination is very powerful. All right. At this point now, I'm near the second last paragraph on 228. She's established that it's not practically necessary, the draft. And of course, it's a basic violation of the principles of America. It then becomes relevant to say, what would the motive be of people who advocate this type of institution? Now, of course, if you began the section on the draft with that question, it would be completely no good. Why not? Somebody at the back want to try? I'm going to take you if you move your hands. back and forth. Why couldn't you start this piece simply by saying on page 226, the draft is a wicked institution. What is the motive of the people behind it? Yes.
Doesn't deal with the argument.
Well, you say it doesn't deal with the argument, but it leaves itself wide open to an obvious answer. Well, you say it would turn off the listeners. Why would it turn them off?
Because you're starting out by perhaps, you're starting out attacking.
You're starting off with an ad hominem, it would sound like. In other words, you're simply attacking the proponents of the draft, not discussing the validity of it. And the immediate answer to the listener would be, well, their motive is to save the country from an aggressor. So first you have to show that this is obviously not a practical means of defending the country. And it's immoral. And then you can say, now on that basis, why would anybody advocate it? And you have a question in the reader's mind. He sees that there's something here that has to be explained. But you had to prepare that, you see. Notice she doesn't answer yet because she wants to build up to this answer to what the motive is. So she simply lays down, that's the question she's concerned with, and then she starts to give some background. The historical context, the conscription of labor in World War II, and make people think there's something more at stake in the draft then, obviously, than what we're being told, because here's something similar to it in the past, and look what direction that measure was moving toward. Then she discusses the alleged financial motive and the actual real cost, which is small in comparison to what goes on. So it can't be financial, which is the motive. So then the question becomes more and more insistent in the reader's mind, what could the motive be then? It's nothing that any of these people say. There must be something fundamental being concealed here, because all the things they say are senseless on the face of it, and yet they're advocating this monstrous measure. Why? You see, you're gathering more and more momentum the more you unravel what they say. Well, she covers one point further before she goes into what could be the motive. The results of the draft on the young men drafted, the results on the youth of the country, which is the touch that's needed to show how truly horrifying this institution is. So this qualifies as what form of what principle of writing that we discussed in Lecture 1. She said it's a violation of rights, and now she is doing what? She's concretizing. She's showing you what would that mean in an actual person's life, the life of the people whose rights are being violated. This is the bottom of 229 and the top of 230. And she shows briefly, but nevertheless specifically. She doesn't just say this has terrible effects on the youth of the country. How the draft would affect specifically the mind of these boys. They're unformed. They're put in a world where it's unknowable. They don't know when they're to be called or for what. They're given this sense of impotence. They feel bitter. And then she points to the kind of signs of the bitterness which anyone can see. The now generation, losing your mind on drugs, etc. Now, you could write an entire dissertation on the draft is destructive to the minds of the draftees, and go on to the requirements of the mind, why force is the antithesis of mind, but she can't cover that. There's no space. That's in itself as a separate topic. But what she does is simply concretize. What would force in this case and context do to the victims? And by simply touching a few things she is able to create, they would be in this unknowable, terrifying, and so on world. And you see that they would give up and there would be all these negative consequences. And so then I mention that because the other paper attempts to do the same thing, only flops completely. And she says, this is what could be saved, this kind of torture to the youth, as opposed to the junk that the money is spent on now, the relatively small amount of money. What then is the real motive? Well, now we have a true horror. We've exposed all the main alleged justifications of it. We've shown that it's immoral, it's impractical, there's nothing to be said for it. And we've in effect intimated there really must be something monstrous behind this kind of advocacy. And now she's able to say what the real motive is, and it comes out of the horse's mouth, which is the horse is beginning on page 230. At this time was General Hershey and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. And you see, I won't recapitulate, the quotes from them leading up directly to the idea that what they want is not the welfare of the country and not even to help the people in the slums, but destruction for its own sake, sacrifice as an end in itself. It's at that point, you see, that she can say what they're after is to turn the youth into sacrificial animals. And by the time she says it, it is clear from the whole preceding context. Therefore, she can say the real issue is, are you a sacrificial animal? Does your life belong to the state or not? And notice she's come back to her starting point. She started with the idea that man has rights, that his life does not belong to the state. And now she's shown that the monstrous motive of the people behind the draft is precisely to turn them into wards of the state, to make them sacrificial animals that they can dispose of as they choose. And she's done this in a way to make it naked that that could be their only motive because everything else is covered. Now, we don't have to go further here, but that's just enough to give you an idea of the type of issues that she covered, indicated, and avoided, and therefore the thing is self-contained even if you don't know egoism, objectivism, as long as you know the idea of individual rights. The paper is self-contained. Now, of course, the more you know, the more you'll get out of it, but that's true of any good writing. The point is, can it be understood without going into more? All right, now let's turn to the other article on the draft. Now, I wrote this one. I did now, let me quickly, I did it deliberately a month ago. This was not a real paper, and I will not take responsibility for it. I did it as an exercise, deliberately, to violate the principle that writing should be self-contained. First I read over Miss Rand's piece, and then I figured I'll make the same points, but I will let myself go. I'll say whatever would be the first thing that would occur to me. The type of thing which in ordinary writing you have to think to yourself, yeah, that would be terrific, but I can't say that here because there's no space, so what can I say instead? Instead, I just took whatever came to me first, and if you understand the sense in which I mean it, it was a marvelous feeling of irresponsibility. I just batted it out, whatever occurred to me, because I didn't have to worry about would it be intelligible or not. And then whichever hole I dug for myself in one paragraph, I tried to get out of it in the next one by sinking in deeper. Now, let's start then on page 3 of the exercises. The second paragraph. What's the first place where I go too broad and raise an issue that I have no business raising in this paper? At the very back. Yes, you say the attack on religion is completely gratuitous here, that religion is irrational and unproved. It's gratuitous, it's not necessary, and people would not see it. Moreover, they would not even see why a conservative has to be religious. A lot of people might think a conservative is simply somebody who's for his country, he's patriotic, and he wants the draft on that grounds. None of that has been explained, and therefore it's as though I'm simply going out of my way, A, to make my opponent philosophical when I haven't given any reason why he must be philosophical, and then B, to take a swipe against his philosophy. And it simply is unconvincing. Now, I hope you will not, I'm trying to keep your context now, so don't assume that because last week and this week I happened to choose an example where you should avoid attacking religion. The moral is not that good writing always is mealy-mouthed about religion. There are many contexts where you can attack religion directly. The only point is, it is not relevant in this type of scope of article. It's not self-contained. All right, now go over to page 4 at the top. And I say about the liberals, they disapprove of the present war. And then I say, now this point is not quite the same point. I here want to illustrate something that we're going to be covering later tonight. So it's not so much the issue of self-contained, it's the way I formulate something. I say on the top of page 4, the war, however, is not really that important. The issue is one of principle. Now, what is wrong with that formulation? Now, that is a perfect example of a sloppy formulation. The war isn't that important. Now, how could on the aisle, the far hand with a light cuff, yes. I think you're wearing glasses. Yes, right, yes. Please repeat. You say it's a floating abstraction. No, I can be more specific of what's wrong with that than this. Suppose I take this literally. We're fighting a war. Let's say it involves 100,000 men dying on the battlefield. And I say we're discussing the draft. The war isn't really that important. What counts, the issue is one of principle. Now, look at that simply straight. You don't know anything about me or what I'm getting at. You're reading what I said, and I said, the war isn't that important. What counts is the principle. Can that very legitimately be interpreted to me? Yes. You're arguing against it. You're saying it would matter to you if you were fighting in it. Correct. But what is the implication of what I say? Ideas are more important than lives, is what it could very easily be taken. Thousands of people are dying, but that isn't so important. What counts is a philosophic principle is at stake. Now, if you put a formulation in such a way as that, your listener can very easily think, what's the matter with this guy? What is the purpose of principles if it's not relevant to human lives? If he can cavalierly say, oh, all these people are dying and there's bloodshed and corpses and so on, but this isn't important. What counts is, do they accept my principle or not? Put it that way, and it's ridiculous. You make your principle divorced from life. Now, what is the actual intention of this formulation, which is not stated and is not objectively clear? Yes? The person is trying to show that you can't resolve the issue by focusing on only one concrete, that you have to have a reason. And actually, if I were to develop that idea, it would be, if you're concrete bound, your stand against the war will not save you from another war in the future that will also take thousands of lives needlessly and irrationally. And consequently, if you're concerned with life, you have to be concerned with principles, you see. Now, actually, it would be very undesirable to go into this whole excursion here, because then I'm going into a dissertation on the role of principles in human life before I even discuss the draft. So it's simply divert the reader, and it can't be clear. But I put it in because I wanted to, it occurred to me, and I thought it's a good, juicy example of a rotten formulation. All right, now we go into the basic argument offered against the draft in the second paragraph on page 4. Man's life is the basic standard of moral value. Any action which harms or threatens life is wrong. The draft threatens life, therefore it's wrong. That's the basic argument offered in this paper. And you see it's in conspicuous contrast to Miss Rand's argument. Where do I pitch the base of this argument? At what concept? There's not rights, but the value of human life, man's life as the standard. Now, those of you who know objectivism know that that is actually the basis of ethics. That's the foundation of ethics. That man's life is the standard of good and evil, right and wrong. That determines every such question as what's right, what's wrong, how man should live and how he shouldn't. But if you know that, you will also know that a long, long discussion is necessary to explain what you're talking about. What is necessary in this connection? Why this standard? Why is man's life? Once you're going to raise the question that this is the basic standard of moral value, That is certainly controversial, whatever you say. Why is this the basic standard? Does it mean then that suicide is always wrong? Isn't God supposed to be the standard, or society? You're going to raise the question of the basic standard of ethics. You can't just throw it away then. That's much more controversial than the draft. And further immediate question in the reader's mind. You have not given any definition, or I have, the writer hasn't, no definition as to what is man's life mean, according to this theory. Does it mean life at any price? What does man's life mean? Does it mean all men as a group collectively is the standard? What? Nothing is here said to elaborate this. It's simply man's life tossed in without any elaboration. And it goes on to say, anything which threatens human life is wrong. Well, what could that very legitimately be taken to mean? Anything which threatens human life, fighting in a war could definitely threaten your life. You can't say when you enlist in the army that's perfectly safe if you're going overseas. So does man's life mean you must never risk anything? Well, you shouldn't go out on a street then because you have to run a risk of being run over by a truck. In fact, if you follow the Food and Drug Administration, the only safe thing is to sip orange juice in a darkened room. Now, obviously, the person is speaking here from a gigantic context, which is that man's life requires certain basic principles, and anything which threatens those principles is wrong, but he hasn't said what the principles are. And the whole structure is omitted. And the result is he goes from the basic proposition of ethics to a last consequence in politics with everything in between omitted. And as the result is completely indefensible and unclear. Now, if you I see you, but I want to speak for a minute. Those of you who took my course on the philosophy of objectivism will know that I started Life as the Standard in lecture, I think, 7. And I didn't get to the draft, I don't believe, till lecture 10. And in between I went, Life as the Standard. And that requires the mind, reason, rationality. And that requires egoism, self-assertion. And that means a whole set of virtues, independence, integrity, productiveness, and so on. And socially, that means a policy of trading, value for value, and respecting the freedom of others. And it means the evil of the initiation of force, and it means individual rights. And the function of the government should therefore be it only on that whole foundation did we then get to the draft, or whichever example we took. Now, by that point, if I say the draft threatens human life, you see the whole structure. It threatens every requirement of human life. But here I haven't said any of the requirements, and it sounds, therefore, like anything other than lying in bed is anti-life, and therefore you shouldn't do it. It's ridiculous and collapses the whole case. Now, picking up the third paragraph on page 4. I hadn't said, what is man's life mean? So I left it perfectly open for a person to say in the next paragraph, well, the draft diesel will help the whole country, and therefore there's a lot of men in a country, so if man's life means the lives of a lot of men, that's for man's life. Now you see, that is a perfectly legitimate confusion, given that I tossed in man's life without any elaboration. Therefore, what could I do, given that I was going to write in this irresponsible way and not throw it out and start over? I had to say, well, I'm against sacrificing one person for another. Now remember, when Miss Rand got to sacrifice in her article, it was only after all the examples were given, so she could do it very briefly, and you could see, yes, that's what it is. Here, I simply, without any preparation, take altruism baldly and say, what you just said is service to others, I reject it. Now, an uninitiated person can perfectly legitimately say, what's wrong with service to others? I mean, in economy, for instance, we exchange goods and services. So your dentist gives you a service. He serves others. Now, that's obviously an equivocation. But there's nothing here to elaborate any of it, so the person says, what's wrong with doing something for other people? Now, by the time you get to it in Miss Rand's article, you know what they have in mind. You know that it's destruction of the able and the healthy and so on for its own sake. But here there's absolutely no explanation. I then make it worse by saying altruism holds that man should suffer, with no explanation. Now, most people would say, oh, that doesn't mean any such thing as that at all. Altruism means be nice to people. Where do you get that man should suffer? Now, it'd take at least half a page, if you're a really good condensed writer, to explain why altruism says that man should suffer. To just toss it into a cold audience is completely inexplicable to them. Now, here's another deliberate equivocation, parenthesis, e.g. Kant. Now, what is wrong with that? What is wrong with that? You say most people wouldn't know what e.g. means. E.g. means for example. Now, I had something else in mind as to what is wrong with that phrase. Yes. Yes, the straightest way of taking that would be altruism holds that man should suffer. For example, Kant should. Now, I put those in deliberately every once in a while because we're going to later make the point you have to read this without knowing what is in the writer's mind. You have to read things straight as they're written. And this could very well be Kant as an example, he should suffer, or his philosophy advocates suffering, or who knows. There's no grammar, it's just e.g. Kant. So in other words, it amounts to telling the reader, whatever the word Kant connotes in your mind, that's my thought. Then I finish up this marvelous paragraph by saying I'm for selfishness. Well, of course, which I would have to because I have to say, well, what else if not for altruism? That, of course, raises up the whole question of what? Selfishness. People think selfishness means cutting other people's throats and running around like a maniac and doing whatever arbitrary thing you feel like and so on. So I have to clarify in some way. So I toss off, well, of course it doesn't mean, this is the next paragraph, it doesn't mean trampling on others or so on. It means preserving your life without sacrificing or accepting sacrifices. Well, what's wrong with that? It's true, certainly true. What's wrong with trying to treat that issue this way, without preparation, without elaboration? I haven't given any examples of what sacrifice would consist of. I haven't given any presentation. Anybody is free, therefore, to take it to mean anything. I don't know what, I haven't made clear what I'm talking about. And an audience might think, well, how can you live this way? Take the case of the draft which we're discussing. If you go and serve in the army, you're sacrificing for your country. And if you don't, other people are sacrificing for you. So either way, somebody is sacrificing. Somebody has to fight in the war. And therefore, this ethics is impractical. Now, of course, you know there is an answer to all that. You know that if you fight in a legitimate war, it's not a sacrifice. But you haven't given any definition, any elaboration, just tossed in this paragraph, no sacrifice. The result is no time to explain and completely unconvincing. Now, to tie this back to the draft after going into this whole dissertation, I say, and of course, it would be a sacrifice to fight in a war you don't believe in. What immediately question would that raise? I guess to do something you don't believe in is a sacrifice, according to him. So you should always just do whatever you believe. I think, gee, they're going to go around thinking, I think, do whatever you believe, regardless of how you arrived at that belief. Well, I don't want to do that, so I'll toss in a paragraph saying, oh, you should be objective. You should prove everything by logic. Now, you see, you know already we're in bad shape. If we're into objectivity and logic, everything is digging me in deeper and deeper. farther and farther away from the draft. Suppose you tell a cold audience in this context, well, you should always act on conclusions that you can prove by logic. What's the immediate reaction then of an audience in this point? Well, then, if the guy's conclusion is wrong about the draft, he shouldn't act on it, and it's perfectly okay to draft him. After all, the author says you should act on logical ideas. Well, if he's wrong about the draft, and the government should know, then he shouldn't act on his views. So, to cover that, I go right away to the next point in that paragraph. Well, even if he's mistaken, it's still wrong to force him. Why? Because when you force a man into the army, you're really forcing his mind, and therefore you're destroying it in the long run. Now that, of course, is true. And we saw in Ms. Rand's article how she was able to indicate that, in what context and in what form. What do I say here to make that understandable? Zero. And therefore, what is the obvious question? Now what I want you to learn is the skill of reading something, even though you know what's in the reader's mind, in the writer's mind. In this case, you know what philosophy I accept, but read what is there, regardless of your own knowledge of what else I would say if I was pressed. And because that's how you have to learn to read your own writing, as though it's written by a stranger and you're reading it from the outside. Suppose you say to an unknowledgeable audience, when you force a man into the army, you're forcing his mind and thus destroying it in the long run. What obvious question would be on any common sense person's mind? I mean, a good person. Well, now think, you see, you're not thinking then if you don't see this, because there's an obvious question. You go up to a stranger and you say that, you know, the draft destroys the minds of all draftees. What would the man on the street legitimately say if that's the total that you told him? Yes. Well, he would say how and why, but he even has something more obvious. He'd think he has the conclusive refutation of that. Namely what? Yes. A lot of people were in the draft and they came back. They weren't all lunatics and insane. They didn't walk around drooling and saying, you know, ish, kadriddle, and so on. Now, you don't give any indication here how you're destroying the mind or in what way, nothing. It's simply you destroy the mind. It's completely arbitrary, and a person would take it to mean you're driving crazy, like brainwashing or something, and they'd say that's a small minority. It's completely unconvincing. Now, you see, Ms. Rand covered it very briefly, but she had a context and just enough points so that by the time you got there, you said, yeah, I can see in the long run it ruins these people. But without context, it just sounds silly. Now, the next sentence just makes it worse still, because I was thinking the person might say, well, what if a person has been irrational, has actually defied reason and decided completely wrongly to go against the war out of whim? Then wouldn't it be okay to force him? Now, what's the proper answer to that topic? You could not begin to include that in a discussion of the draft. You couldn't, because that raises the whole question of who is to judge in a political context whether the man has been irrational or not. And in any event, this whole issue is peripheral in a free country. But if you raise it, then you have to go into a whole dissertation that's simply out of the question. Notice, what do I do in order to get out of that? Oh no, I want first one more formulation of a bad formulation. This is the last part of the 5th paragraph. And so on, even if he's been irrational, it is still his mind's conclusion, and as such it must be respected by others. What's wrong with that? See, I deliberately pocked this article with bad formulations so you get used to spotting them. On the aisle, yes. You say it throws you into the depths of subjectivism. It certainly sounds like it. Why? You should respect his conclusion regardless of how irrational it is. Well, why? His conclusion is true for him? Is that the idea? Well, now what is it that the person wants to say, the writer? He has a political right to come to this conclusion. You should respect his right, even though his actual viewpoint, let us say, is completely wrong. But there's no such distinction made. They just say respect. Respect it. It's not even clear whether the it is his conclusion, his mind, his right, what? And that is a very sloppy formulation. Now, if you go on to the next paragraph, I make up something that a neutral listener could say. Well, the government's forcing the truth on him if he's wrong, so isn't that helping him? Now, of course, the only way to answer this would be to discuss what is the mind, why does it require freedom, why can't you force truth on people, but that's a big dissertation. Again, you couldn't cover that in a paper of this length. So what is it that I do in desperation? I suddenly turn on my tormentor, which is the audience, and start asking rhetorical questions. Now that's okay, but look at the questions that I ask. What's wrong with that collection of questions? How does the government know what's true? Is it no more than the citizens? How can it set itself up as the absolute judge? Isn't there any room for disagreement in a free country? Now what is wrong with that set of questions? You see, there's a writer here obviously feels he's got to get rid of the idea that the government can force the truth on you, and the issues involved are simply too much for him, so it goes on the offensive, and it's like tossing out hostility right and left at his tormentor only. By the way those questions come up, what is the net effect of those four questions? Well, you say it advocates anarchy. How did you get that? You mean skepticism in the sense that nobody can know anything? If you mean that, I certainly see that, because how can the government be the absolute judge? And the clear implication is what? Who can say what is absolute truth? There are no absolutes. It's all a matter of opinion. How can the government be so certain? We can't be certain. So it doesn't state, but it implies skepticism and subjectivism. And at the same time, mixed in with that is what other viewpoint? Not a bad epistemological view, but a legitimate political view, which is the other half of those two questions, of those four questions. Yes. In a free country, there can be disagreements, so there's two entirely different questions mashed together there. Is truth objective? That is an epistemological question about the status of human knowledge. And should man have a right to reach conclusions by his own judgment or be subject to governmental coercion? That's a political question. But this writer simply mashes the two together and therefore leaves the implication: if you advocate freedom, you have to be a skeptic. On the other hand, if there's absolute truth, we can give the government the power to force it on us. And therefore, it's a very, very devastating, harmful implication simply by the nature of the questions. Now, the next paragraph is a sort of a token example, discussion of practicality, but it's obviously very unconvincing. Why is it unconvincing? This is the third last paragraph on page 4. Why is that so unconvincing? Well, I'm supposed to be now turning to practicality, having allegedly given a theoretical base, which is in fact a catastrophe. But what is so unconvincing? I'm trying to see somebody at the back. Yes. I don't offer any illustrations. The brilliant thing I say is that men always volunteer if they approve of the war. Well, what's the question immediately in anybody's mind? Would they approve of any war, or would they all take the attitude, to hell with the war, let's just mind our own business and be overrun? Now, in Ms. Rand's article, she says they would approve except under condition A and B. But I just passed that by, so it's completely unconvincing. And then notice what is wrong with the sentence in that paragraph. This is especially true in the modern age with our different weapons. Now, that is a perfect example of bad writing, that sentence. It's a small example, but it's very eloquent of poor communication. This is especially true, that is, that volunteer army is good, with our different weapons. Now, what is wrong with that as a fun, in the blue, yeah?
It's left different, very ambiguous. It could mean any one of the whole slew of things.
Yeah, what do you mean by different weapons? Different from what? I mean, we have bow and arrows now, or what? What has it got to do with anything? Now, what does the person actually intend? The point of technological advancement and nuclear warfare and so on. But this is a typically modern sloppiness. You don't bother to say what you mean or what you're talking about. All you have in mind, you see, in writing, the first thing that may be fed you is something different about our weapons today from the past, and that's relevant to the draft. And then it may take a pause to think, what's different? Well, it's much more complex, much more technology and so on. What is the right word? And you have to grope until you can say, oh, this is exactly the point I mean, and now it's clear. But instead, people are taught to, quote, be natural, that is, slop out whatever comes, and therefore the first thing that would logically come is, well, things are different today. So they say, it applies especially today with our different weapons, which does not state the point and simply leaves the thing vague and unconvincing. A great deal of modern writing is exactly that. That's a small example of it. It's in effect a hint, a subjective hint, but not an actual objective statement. And then notice the statement in that paragraph, the real issue today is money. Now, what's wrong with that as a formulation? Yes. Yes, it makes it appear that the whole issue of the draft is only a financial question. There's nothing ideological, there's nothing important philosophical, moral. It's just money. Well, that, of course, is what the advocates of the draft would like to say. And so you throw away the whole case by a sloppy statement. The person doesn't mean the real issue is money. He means the practical way to resolve the problem is to pay the volunteers more money, so they'll enlist. But instead of saying that, he just slops it out. You know, the big thing is money. And if you take that formulation straight, it simply implies that's all that counts. Now, the next paragraph, number I, simply makes it, second from the bottom on page 4, simply makes it worse because having given a poor case against the draft, he then goes on to say, and on top of that, the government shouldn't have the power to tax. Now, that is even more controversial than the draft. So it would take a much longer article, but this person simply drags it in, too. And notice his defense of, well, we don't have to worry about taxes now because the last sentence, the right to life is, the last sentence of that paragraph, the right to life is more important than the right to property, because it's the source of all rights. Well, how's that for a formulation? The right to life is more important than the right to property. What is the clear implication? Yeah, sometimes we have to choose between the two, and in that case, the right to property is not so important. After all, the right to life is the basis. If that's true, what is the perfect comeback for the advocate of the draft? The right to life is the source of freedom, too. So if it's more important than property, it's more important than freedom. So if we can get rid of property on when we need to, we get rid of freedom also. After all, it's in the name of saving the country from aggressors, preserving the lives of the citizens. You see, a formulation like that is the same as taking a knife and stabbing it in your chest. You're finished. That's a mortal wound from which you can't recover, in the sense that you've destroyed your case, your argument, your logic, your conviction. You've lost your audience. It's irretrievable. You'd have to burn the whole thing and start over. Now, in a rough draft, that's okay, as long as you then exit out and state what you mean. And in this case, you shouldn't cover that issue at all because you can't throw it away and there's no space. And now at the end, I conclude if you grasp all of this, you see why they're so evil. All they want is power and they're destroying the country's youth. And you see it's completely unprepared, absolutely arbitrary. I don't give any idea why I would say that. And therefore it just falls completely flat. Whereas in Miss Rand's, by the time you got there, it was completely prepared. All right, from those two, you can keep that in mind as the good and the bad examples of the principle, don't raise that which you can't explain. Keep your writing self-contained. All right, let us continue. I want to turn briefly now to a broader theoretical issue. The concept of objectivity as such. This course is titled Objective Communication, and I indicated that I would tell you what I meant by that this evening. It includes the issue of objectivity in communication, many of the points that we've already discussed, but it's a broader way of looking at them. It includes the issue of your writing being self-contained. It includes rationalism and what's wrong with that, and many other sins and problems. I didn't start with this because we needed certain concretes and background to make the issue clear, but now we can discuss it abstractly. What then is objectivity in communication, whether we speak of writing or oral presentation? Well, first I want to define for you the term objective as it's used in philosophy. And I trust for most of you this is just a reminder. It's used in the branch of philosophy known as metaphysics, which studies the nature of the universe, and it also has a separate meaning in epistemology. So let's look at each of those and then see what it would mean as applied to communication. In metaphysics, objective means independent of consciousness. In metaphysics, objective means independent of consciousness. A fact is said to be objective if it is what it is, independent of anybody's consciousness. In other words, the object, the thing out there, sets the terms, as opposed to the subject, the mind, the consciousness. So if we look at this table, we can all of us look at it, wish desperately that it go out of existence, pray that it go out of existence, plead, pretend, do whatever we want within the mind, within the subject, but the object is immutable. It's independent of what goes on in consciousness. In that sense, it is objective. And of course, according to objectivism, this is one of the sources of the very name of the philosophy, all facts are objective. A is A, and things are what they are regardless of who thinks what, feels what, and so on. The opposite of objective would be subjective, which would mean dependent on consciousness. A subjective fact would be one controlled by consciousness, one which goes in or out of existence depending on the whims of the consciousness in charge. The ostrich, for instance, is supposed to be a subjectivist in this sense. He doesn't look, and he assumes it's not there. If he doesn't see it, the thing goes out of existence. In any event, that would be a classic example of subjectivism. Obviously, objectivism denies that facts are subjective. Now, in epistemology, that's the theory of knowledge. In this branch of philosophy, the term objective applies not to facts, but to minds, to mental processes or mental contents. To be objective, as the term is used in epistemology, designates a certain way of using the mind. And in essence, that way is adhering to the object. In other words, the object of cognition, which is the things out there you're trying to know reality. To be objective means adhering to reality in using one's mind and coming to conclusions. In other words, being guided at each step of one's mental processes by facts, by existence, as against what would the opposite be, being guided by the arbitrary content of consciousness, of the subject, such as feelings, desires, and so on. So to be objective in this sense is to recognize that A is A, and that's the base of all your mental activity. Facts are what they are. Your mind is the faculty of grasping, of looking out, of perceiving, not of creating facts. And therefore, in reaching conclusions, in thinking, in conducting your mind, you have to adhere only to the facts and get your guidance from there. If you start making it up out of whole cloth by the arbitrary promptings of the subject, you will simply be wrong. And here the classic example is the old Jack Webb dragnet from many years ago. You know that famous line, "Just give us the facts, man." That is the essence of objectivity mentally, epistemologically. In other words, focus outward on the object, the out there, the factual. So we could summarize these two as saying, in metaphysics, it means the object comes first. It is what it is, independent of the subject. And in epistemology, it is the object must set the terms of your mental functioning. You have to conform your thought to what's out there. Now, these are the purely philosophic uses of the terms. How would it apply to writing or communication? What would an objective presentation be? Now, you can't apply it in a simple-minded way, because you would say, well, you might say, well, if objective means independent of consciousness, then an objective presentation would be one which is independent of consciousness. Well, obviously, you couldn't have that, because we're talking about a conceptual presentation, which depends on you, the presenter, and has no meaning aside from the consciousness of somebody or other who's going to grasp it, hold it, interpret it, and so on. What then does objectivity mean applied to communication? Well, I'll give it to you in a mouthful and then elaborate. Objective communication is communication in which you have been objective in presenting the material, that is, in the epistemological sense. Your mind has functioned objectively, and the result is the meaning and validity of your paper is now independent of your consciousness. It is clear without the need of any intervention by you. I'll repeat that. Objective communication involves both those. It means epistemologically, in writing, in presenting your material, you have followed facts. You have been objective in such a way that the result stands independent of you. Its meaning and its validity is now clear without anything further from you. In that sense, it is now an entity apart from you. You don't have to, if your presentation has been objective, rush in at each sentence when the person reads and say, no, I meant so-and-so. Or, oh, I forgot to put in this. Or, well, if this isn't clear, look at it this way. If your presentation requires that, obviously, it is dependent on you still. It is like a baby that's half born and half still trailing the cord. When you have an objective presentation, you have so thoroughly adhered to reality in organizing it, delimiting it, taking your audience's context into account, concretized and so on, that the presentation now stands independent by itself. It's as though your presentation is now like an external fact. It's like an object now apart from you. And in that sense, it is objective. So to summarize, an objective presentation, you are using your mind objectively, and the result is the product becomes like an object apart from you. versus a subjective presentation would be one in which you have departed from reality, you've been arbitrary, you have in some way or other been subjective in your presentation, and the result is your product needs continual clarification, elaboration, examples, answers to objections. Otherwise, your piece would legitimately be misinterpreted and unconvincing. It wouldn't stand on its own. So subjective in this sense means the piece is dependent on the speaker in the sense of depends on him to add in more than is already there. It's improperly dependent on him. It's not, his message is not there, real, on paper. For example, war isn't all that important. What counts is the principle, which we had from the first half, or several of those others. The right to life is more important than the right to property, or money is the real issue. All of those are non-objective formulations. In all cases, they don't stand independent of you. You have to rush in and say, no, I didn't mean that, and it's legitimate. The person would interpret you as meaning so-and-so. You have to, in other words, your goal has to be to present ideas in such a way that when you have done it, they stand clearly as facts by themselves. Now, of course, it depends on an audience context. The baby wouldn't understand it. But assuming a certain context, the presentation stands by itself. This means you might find the following parallel helpful. You have to learn to see your writing as you would a legal document. Now, not a legal document interpreted by a shyster, because anything goes then, but by a rational lawyer, assuming such could be found. You have to read your writing with the same seriousness that you would read a contract, a legal contract. Now, you wouldn't sign something where the contract said, in case of disagreement, something drastic will happen to your property. Well, we'll worry about it when the time comes. You would not sign that. You'd be very eager to know what exactly is going to happen and who decides what's drastic and are there any limits and so on. Well, the same has to be true for all writing, particularly ideological writing on which the fate of the world depends. You have to mean what you say and aim to be precise in your statement and its implications, just as you would in a legal document. And then you will be objective. To do that, the best advice I can give you is something I mentioned in a question period, I think. Read what you have written after you're finished it, after you've written it and edited it. Look at it as an outsider. Set aside everything that, quote, I know inside my mind. Look only at what you actually have on paper, as a neutral audience would see it, which is not a mind reader. And ask yourself what misinterpretations, confusions, etc. would be possible to this kind of neutral audience. Assuming, remember, a rational audience, because, I stress this, if you're going to allow irrational misinterpretations, there's no way to do it. Anything you say can be distorted and misinterpreted by hecklers. There's no way whatever to satisfy the irrational. But assuming an audience that is not irrational, look at your presentation cold and ask, how might it legitimately be misinterpreted? And what can I do to avoid that possible misreading? Now, this is a skill. It takes time to acquire. You have to learn to throw the switch. First, you're writing and you're concerned with getting what you have in here in your mind out there on paper. Then you're looking at it coldly for its objectivity, and you're looking at it strictly as an outsider. You're cutting yourself off from everything you have inside your mind that you didn't put on paper. And you're asking, what have I actually said? And in fact, if you want, it may be helpful to look at it as somebody else's paper and say to yourself, what has he or she actually said? As though this is not written by you. And then read it from that perspective, adding in nothing. And you'll sometimes be very surprised. You'll see whether the thing is an object or you're still counting on the subject to ward off misconceptions. If I could give you a very recent personal example, I'm preparing an excerpt from my book for a forthcoming issue of the Objectivist Forum, the magazine. And it's a presentation of American history ending on the Richard Nixon. That is, the excerpt does. And the excerpt, as actually written in the book, indicates that the country got fed up with the new left and decided to move more conservative, and then people turned to the right or something. And then I had the line in the actual book, there was no one there but Richard Nixon. And I decided to just cut the excerpt for publication off right there. Obviously, I wanted to convey this is hopeless. If this is what the country was offered, then it's a real fiasco. In the book, that was perfectly okay because this came after, 500 pages. And my view of conservatives and Nixon and so on was so clear that there was no question. But when I read the excerpt over just by itself, without any of the other hundreds of pages, it came to the end, it was obvious that that sentence is susceptible of an entirely different interpretation which I would never have dreamed of originally. Namely, it's as though it's a bitter post-Watergate crack. The only hope of the country was Nixon, and they destroyed him, you see. There was no one there but Richard Nixon, and it ends, you see. And I nowhere say in the article my view, and it's like how bitter I am that the hope, the great hope of the future was destroyed by the leftists, you see. Now, obviously, you would die at the idea that you could be interpreted that way, and yet, without a context, it could be taken that way. So this is non-objective. I know my intention, but in that context, it didn't come across, so I had to reword it. It took a minor rewording to eliminate that. Now, I couldn't start a whole song and dance with a brief excerpt. So I simply reworded it as, in the country looked to the right, there was nobody there. All they found was Richard Nixon. You see, and it kept the same idea, only by making it there was nobody there, it made clear I reject the whole conservatives. And the only thing they found then was Nixon. You see, it's almost exactly the same wording, but put this way, it closes out in advance the possibility that someone would think I'm sympathetic to Nixon, whereas the other way, they could think that, you see. Now, there's a small example of what typically comes up in writing all the time. You know exactly what you intend, but if you don't read it objectively, you would be astounded at what people could legitimately interpret it to mean. Now, again, I do not want to intimidate you with things of this sort. There is no way in my knowledge to write except to commit this error thousands of times and gradually discover from experience how to do this. So don't feel that it's a disaster if you make inadvertent subjective formulations. I just want you to be familiar with the issue, and then little by little, you will, I hope, develop your ability to do it. Now, by way of a little detail here, let me give you some different categories of non-objective formulation. I more or less arbitrarily give you 3 different categories. These overlap, but it's sort of like a rough guide, so you have some way to break down this broad discussion of objectivity. The most obvious form of non-objectivity is arbitrary statements, undefended statements. This is really the issue of being not self-contained. In other words, when you say something unprepared, unexplained, it's not clear why you say it. Obviously, that is not objective, because it doesn't stand on its own. The audience needs you to add in some reason why you're saying this. Now we know you can't prove everything, so you have to in some way delimit your piece. And we've given examples of this, so I don't have to say much about this. There'll be more examples in the exercise. The important thing is, if a point is significant to your talk or your paper, and it is not self-contained, you have to defend it in some terms. You can't make it just a simple arbitrary assertion. Otherwise, it is not objective. The audience doesn't see why you're saying it. Now, another broad category pertains not to the lack of defense, but the actual wording of a statement. We call it broadly a poor formulation, one which can be taken legitimately in different ways. In other words, it might be vague and undefined, so you have to grope for what could it mean. It might be ambiguous. It might have two or more different meanings at the same time. It might have misleading implications, and therefore commit you by implication to something that you would never dream of accepting, such as that statement, the war isn't that important, which implied in that context that ideas are more important than mass slaughter. Any of those would be non-objective, not in the first sense that you're not arguing for them, but in the second sense that they are simply not clear, they're susceptible of different meanings, and therefore, for the person actually to grasp what you're saying, you have to rush in and say, oh, I didn't mean so-and-so, I meant so-and-so. Now, if you want an example that I made up, take the excerpt sheet. Take out the homework sheet. I've given you actually many examples in the first half of this, but take one more. Take exercise B of the excerpt sheet. I'll give you a moment to read this. B, on page 5. No individual, no government can exert a deleterious influence on the achievement of any other person's rightful values or goals. Well, is that true or false? Yes.
You don't know, because you don't define anything. You don't say what a proper capitalist system is. You don't say what a deleterious influence is.
All right, you say I don't say what a proper capitalist system is, I don't say what a deleterious influence is, and consequently you can't judge whether this statement is true or not. Well, let's me for the moment play the devil's advocate and say, well, I mean a deleterious influence, something that's harmful, negative, that prevents the person from achieving their rightful goals. So is that, that's like a dictionary definition of deleterious. Yes, the lady on the aisle at the back. You're saying I'm not stating what my rightful values and goals are. Well, I can't state everything, though. In an article, suppose I say, well, for instance, my rightful goal would be to attract students, to make money, and under capitalism, nobody can put a gun to my student's head. Nobody can steal my money, so it's a perfectly true statement. What's wrong with that? Well, okay, but then is the statement was okay, is that right? It's true? Is it true or not? So it's not true. Well, how could anybody, in a capitalist system, they can't force the students not to attend, they can't steal my money, so in what way would they, yes? Well, you say there's other ways that someone could take away my students. They could have a more interesting lecture. Now, true, that would be, if we take this literally, if my goal is to have students, and that's a rightful goal, I mean, it's nothing wrong with that goal, it's perfectly proper. This person giving a lecture in the next room is exerting a definitely deleterious influence on the achievement of my rightful goal. And consequently, we have to have anti-competition laws, anti-dog-eat-dog competition to protect my rightful goals. Now, what is wrong with that? What is it that permits that kind of interpretation? Which one word is the worst in this whole thing? No, not law. Not achievement, no. Deleterious, because it is so vague that it encompasses any kind of negative influence. Now, in a capitalist system, you can have every kind of negative influence you want over other people except one, if we're talking about law. And what is that? Initiation of physical force, or fraud, which is an indirect version of it. That's all the law prohibits. And therefore, the government can't, as a matter of, no government as a matter of law can affect your achievement of your values by the initiation of force. Now you're talking, we know what you're talking about. But as it's worded here, it leaves it wide open. You have no idea what you're talking about. And the result is you leave yourself open to every kind of misinterpretation and every kind of bad law. Notice also a minor thing in this. Now, this is a very minor error. I'm not going to make a bugaboo of punctuation. But for the heck of it, what is wrong with in a proper capitalist system, comma, just that much? It needs a comma after proper. Otherwise, it implies there are two kinds of systems, a proper capitalist system and an improper capitalist system. And there is no such thing. Whereas if there's a comma, it means in a system which is both proper and capitalist, which is just what the person means to say. Whenever you put an adjective, it implies the existence of the non-adjective. A proper capitalism implies an improper capitalism. An old woman implies a non-old woman. And therefore, always remember that you have to punctuate appropriately. But I don't want to. Punctuation is beyond our purview here. Now, let me look at the one-third category of non-objectivity. This one pertains not to the formulation being poor or undefended. The formulation might be okay, it might be true, it might be plausible, understandable, but its placement, its position is misleading. In other words, it is in a context which makes it imply something which the author does not mean. So the statement is clear and true, but where it is wrong. And therefore, again, it does not stand alone. The author has to rush in and say, well, just because I put this together with that other statement, don't draw such and such a conclusion, which he shouldn't do. So the three issues really, what do you say? Why? Does the audience know why? And where do you say it? Are the three centers around which the issue of objectivity pertains. The clarity of the formulation, the reasons, and the context. Now, for an example of this, take a look at G on page 6. G on page 6. Now, I may say from this point on, all of the examples that I use are real examples. That is, I made up A and B on this page, but the rest I've taken from actual people that I know who are with all nice people, and therefore some are in this audience. So I'm going to begin now to live up to what I said the opening night and be completely unfriendly in commenting on these. And if you make comments from the class, please take account of the fact that all authors are legitimately very sensitive, and make your comment in an appropriately respectful fashion. Now, I will give you a chance to read G now because I didn't assign it. All right, I may just say for purposes of further protecting the anonymity of the sources, I'm going to use he, regardless of the sex of the author. Now, exercise G is a very good example of placement because the statements are true, they're clear, leaving aside one possible one, they're understandable, but by the placement, there is a very definite implication which the author does not intend. Does anybody, now this is not an easy example. Real life examples are not as easy as the ones that you make up as exercises. So don't hold it against yourself if you find any of these not that clear, as long as you get some clear so you know what we're talking about. If any given one passes you by, don't hold it against yourself. But does anybody see what I have in mind as the problem with this passage? Yes?
Well, it implies that you should seek pain and avoid pleasure.
You say it implies that you should seek pain and avoid pleasure. And in effect, it does amount to something on that order. Now, here's the situation. Hume takes a certain kind of hedonist view, that the only way to define good and evil is by pleasure and pain. The author, as an objectivist, wants to refute that. He wants to show, in effect, that if you simply go by what gives you pleasure and pain, that will not necessarily lead you to a rational conclusion. And he thinks, well, a simple way of showing it will be to say, thinking is painful for many people, and yet it's necessary for life. So if we go by pleasure and pain, a lot of people would choose not to think, and that would obviously be irrational, therefore Hume is wrong. Now, that argument, as far as it goes, is correct. It's true that thinking is often painful to many people, and to everybody in some form if it's really difficult material. It's not unclear what he's saying, but what is the implication in this context? The implication in this context is, by the sheer placement of it, is to hell with pleasure. I hold life as the standard, and the fact, therefore, that something is painful is zero. It doesn't matter to me at all. Maybe something will be terribly painful by the standard of life, even so you should do it. Now, could you defend this as a philosophic proposition? Could you say something leads unavoidably and necessarily to protracted pain? Nevertheless, it's the good for man. You couldn't. You could not defend such a proposition. If you know the objectivist ethics, you know that life and happiness or pleasure come down to one fundamental issue, namely the achievement of values, and that what fosters life also fosters happiness and pleasure. You know that it is not true that life points in one direction and pleasure in the opposite, and that you have to choose, and that if such a choice did take place, then you have the horrible clash of the moral versus the practical and all the disasters of the history of philosophy. You also know that it is true that thinking is painful for some people. But what else is true of those people? That those people for whom thinking is characteristically painful will generally find everything more or less painful. They'll be out of control, they'll be anxious, they'll be self-doubtful, so they'll be more or less miserable no matter what they do. And the most they can hope for is momentary relief, escape from the pain of the moment till it strikes them again tomorrow. So they're hardly an example of human nature. Now here's a simple example. It's certainly true, clear to say, thinking is painful for many people. But if you said it in this context, trying to refute pleasure as the standard of ethics, the implication is the ethics I advocate is oblivious to pleasure. We don't care one way or the other if you suffer or not. We only care what life requires. So you had an easy polemic against Hume at the price of implying a whole theory that you don't subscribe to. Now the same thing is true of the next part of it, that people can live pleasurably off the effort of others, that non-thinking may be pleasurable. Well, again, it may be pleasurable in some sense to some people, but in what sense would it be pleasurable? The sense that of the same type that would get relief momentarily from not thinking in the above sentence. But again, it is not true in the sense of applicable to human nature. But if it were true in this context, in this connection, why should you think then? If it's true that you could avoid thinking and live pleasurably off the effort of those who do think, why not do it? What argument could anybody have? There's no use to say reality is against it, because then you're saying, well, reality points one way and pleasure points the other. which means man is intrinsically at war with reality. Once you accept that view, then you're lost philosophically completely, because you either have to defy reality or suffer. And so what's your hope? Now the person here, you see, by the attempt to get a polemic against Hume of this kind, says true facts in a context which commits him to something he would never want. The last sentence of excerpt G, I may say, indicates that the person is not clear when he wrote this on his view, because he says, if you acquire your values by Hume's method, notice, quote, it would be very unusual to find a man holding a rational, consistent set of values following Hume's method. Now, what is wrong with that statement? It would be very unusual to find someone who followed Hume's method and held a rational, consistent code of values. What's wrong with that as a statement? Yes. Yes, it implies it's unusual, but it's possible. Now, in fact, we define our terms here. Hume's method means be a rampant emotionalist. If something makes you feel good, accept it. If not, not. Now, if that is your method, it is impossible to have a rational code of values if you understand why ethics is necessary to begin with. That man's not automatically set to choose the right code, that he has to figure it out in principle, that he may have out of context emotions and so on. If you know why reason is man's means of knowledge, then you know that it's more than very unusual to reach objectivism by following your emotions as your standard. It's impossible. All right, we don't have to pursue this one. Objectivity, to sum up, includes your formulation, its defense, and the context. And all of these exercises, these excerpts, test basically these three issues, sometimes more than one of them, plus a one-fourth one, namely rationalism, which is present in some of these excerpts, which we discussed last time. So basically, these excerpts will either be vague and imprecise, or they will contain something arbitrary, undefended, or the placement, the context of some part of them will be misleading, or it will be rationalism. Now let us do some of these now, and then we maybe, depending upon how many we get done, we'll do some each time to keep going on the issue of objectivity. Now, you were to have done at least the first four for tonight. We did B briefly. Let us look at A on page 5. Just I'll give you a second to reread A. This is supposed, by the way, to be a definition of justice. This one I made up. Now here again, I would like you to read it as though you did not already know the objectivist definition of justice, of which this is a kind of a very poor approximation. But as if you simply read it cold, objectively, and tell me what you think of this as a formulation. Justice means having the right idea about men, acting on it, and usually it means giving others the equivalent of what they give you. Now, first of all, what type of non-objectivity is this most blatantly? Anybody raise up? Yes. This is definitely vague. Very vague. Why? Tell me different things you could read into it. Tell me what you haven't pinned down about it, if you can.
I'm not quite sure
Yeah, it's hard to put into words, I know, but just stumble for it and see what you would say.
what right idea. What does right mean?
You say, well, what right idea? It means having the right idea, but, well, what does he mean? And I say, well, he goes on to say, based on the facts, but that's also very vague. What kind of facts? Now, for instance, let me give you an example of what would be perfectly compatible with this formulation. I could say, well, if this is the objectivist theory of justice, I take it to mean the following, and this would not be distortion, it would be completely legitimate. As I see the facts, all men are really vicious. They're out to lie and cheat, and they want government to help them, and so on. So the right idea, one based on the facts of reality, would be that everybody is rotten. Justice means having the right idea about men and acting on it at all times. So then justice means recognizing that everybody's vicious and acting on it. And then it goes on to say most times the appropriate action is a trade. In other words, giving others the equivalent of what they give you. Well, what they give you is usually they do something rotten to you. So therefore I'll do it to them before they do it to me. So the person reads this paragraph and says, now I know what justice is according to objectivism. It's going up to a stranger on the street and punching him in the mouth. Now, that is not an exaggeration. This formulation leaves open an interpretation of that kind. It's extremely vague. It doesn't give you any guideline as to what is a right idea and what is an equivalent, and consequently, it's simply wide open. It tells you, in effect, well, somehow have an appropriate idea about other people and do something commensurate. But it leaves wide open. It's completely empty, vague. Now, what would you have to do if you wanted to tie this down and make it more specific? You have to say, now I'm not going to dictate to you a whole definition. You can look that up in the objectivist literature. But the idea is you have to say, justice is a virtue. It pertains to estimating men's characters. You have to estimate them according to a certain standard of value. You have to estimate them according to the actual facts, not according to your arbitrary desires and so on. You have to act accordingly, and by trade I mean give value for value, by mutual consent and so on. In other words, you say something to make it more specific than have the right idea and do something about it, you see, which is so vague that it's open to any interpretation. All right, take a look at C. Now, C is, I don't know, so subtle that maybe it won't be clear at all what is the problem with it, but let's look at it briefly. Reread C. Now, just to give you an advance suggestion here, everything that he says is true in this paragraph. So there's no bad formulations, or at least that's not what I'm focused on. And let's assume that in the rest of the paper he defends this, so it's not the issue that it's arbitrary. There's one particular thing only that I wanted to illustrate, but I'm not sure how objectively clear the error would be, so I'll see what you would say. Yes. Well, no, there's somebody behind you. Yes, with the cuff showing. Yeah.
Well, I think it might take it to deny free will.
You take it to deny free will. How do you get that?
The last sentence, he must have one seek and one seek.
Well, you say the last sentence denies free will. You mean because you're taking he must as meaning he has to, he has no choice? Right. No, that was not intended. That was not my point in offering it, because you can use must for he should. It's a common use of you must tell the truth, not meaning that you're determined to, but it's your moral obligation to. So I wouldn't want to get too picky. I think in this context, I wouldn't pick that objection. Yes, on the aisle.
Implication of a mind-body dichotomy.
You see the implication of a mind-body dichotomy. Where do you see that?
He must use the single most important tool in the Bible.
Well, because they say that the mind is the single most important tool, You say that implies the body is the opposite of the mind. No, I think that's too picky. You can say the mind is the most important tool of survival in the sense of the specific faculty guiding your action, enabling you to survive. It doesn't have to imply that the body is insignificant or unimportant. But the body is not a tool of survival as such. It's you that you're trying to survive. Now, I have something in mind, not in the actual wording, but in the placement of one sentence. So it's not, I mean, you see, this is a good example simply to show you if you want to start picking on something, you can pick on anything of anybody. There is no way to avoid it. So we may as well make this poor author the example of that. I did not mean to pick on every word, but simply one thing. Yes, I'm trying to get something different. Yes, Jared. You say the mind does not have an identity. No, according to objectivism, it does. Oh, I see. In the way, in the placement of that. Yes, you're correct. The error that I had in mind was the placement of the second sentence. Now, if the second sentence was pulled out of there and put into a later paragraph, there'd be no problem. Because then you would say, everything in the universe has a specific identity, and so does man. His identity is he survives by the use of his mind. He must therefore seek and want nothing but rational goals. Then you would have laid down clearly, this is what's common, this is the principle, this is the requirement of survival and happiness. Then later, after you'd elaborate that, you can say, now, of course, there are many differences among people, but all those differences are lesser. They're within the framework of we all have reason, we all have to use it, that's the fundamental, you see. But the way it's put this way, we're told that there's these innumerable differences before we're told that we survive by the mind. And therefore, what question right away does that raise? What interpretation does it open up? Maybe all the optional differences apply, what? Even to the point about using the mind. Where is the solid universal fact? As if we read this in the context, in the placement, it comes out like this if I stress it a little, if I exaggerate it a bit. Everything is something specific. Of course, every man is different, very different from every other. But still we have to use what we have in common, although to be sure we can use it very differently because none of us is really the same. You see, and if you get that implication in, you're on the path to subjectivism, which will infect all the later formulations. Whereas, if you simply took that issue of everybody is different and waited until you had firmly established what is the same and what is the objective basis, then they wouldn't do that. Otherwise, here the placement colors everything that's to come. Now, as I say, that is a very subtle one, and I'm not going to make a big song and dance about that. Let's look at D. Now scan this carefully, rather quickly. This was assigned. I want to say on defense of the author, this was a rough draft prior to being edited, and I asked him if I could have the rough draft simply because it would give an example of something that's typical in a rough draft and that's in no way bad so long as you then edit it out. So scan this just to refresh your recollection. D. Now, I'd like to point out something good at the very beginning of this excerpt. And that is, there is something very good about the opening of this excerpt. The first, let me see, 2 sentences. What is good about that opening? Yes. Well, you say it recapitulates the assignment. In other words, it goes right to the heart of the assignment. That's true, but there's something even beyond its obvious relevance. Yes. It's a very positive, it's a forthright, non-appeasing statement. This student is having obviously no truck with the professor. You get the professor's viewpoint from simply seeing that he describes Americans worrying about Chappaquiddick as obsession with repentance. And so when that kind of assignment is being given, you can get an idea from that of the politics of the professor and his viewpoint. Well, this student is laying down his context from the outside. You imply, he says, in effect, that this is a bad thing. It's a good thing. That's my viewpoint. And that's forthright, non-appeasing, and it is self-contained. What makes it self-contained? Yes?
He says right away what he means.
It says right off, the second sentence, repentance means concern about morality. Now, if the professor wants to contest that, he in effect is put in the position of saying, well, I'm an amoralist, which he's not allowed to do by the act of the day. And therefore, it's a good forthright opening. But what happens? The student got carried away by his zeal. He was doing fine. He laid down his terms, but, and this is very typical of a rough draft, on the rush of feeling of fury at this kind of thing, he went to the next statement, which was, what's wrong with the next statement? I'm trying to take different people here with the red tie, yes.
The value hierarchy of morals is sort of turned upside down. This is one issue of Senator Kennedy.
Now be a little more specific. You said the value hierarchy of morals is turned upside down. Why? The statement is, if anyone ever gave pause to a moral man's mind, Edward Kennedy would certainly be at the top of the list. In other words, if you made a list of immoral people, people that would make a moral man rear back, the top of the list would be Edward Kennedy. Now that is another way of saying what? Edward Kennedy is the worst man in history, or the worst man alive today. And obviously, the least you could say about that is you can't regard that as self-evident. Now, actually, of course, it is an overstatement. Edward Kennedy would be high up. But the top of the list, there are some numbers of people who have done many worse things. So the effect there is an undefended statement, you see. A statement not justified. And that's unfortunate because then it retroactively makes the opening sound, oh, it's just emotional. The person can't really defend his viewpoint. Now look at the next paragraph. Again, it's well organized. He says there's going to be two things involved, and he's going to focus only on the second. But what is the problem if we take just one thing in that paragraph that is also non-objective? Now remember, this is not for the Society of Haters of Kennedy. This is for a neutral audience. There's a hand with, I think it's a plaid shirt. Yes. You say the statement that Kennedy's ideas are evil is unsupported, and that's true. That is unsupported here. In what way is it unsupported? You're not told which ideas, why, and why evil. That they're wrong is one thing. Even that would require some indication. But that they're evil, no, normally a person who doesn't have a specific philosophy and look at things from the perspective of a certain code of morality would say, well, why? What is evil about political ideas? He wants, let us say, national health insurance, and he wants wage and price controls, and he wants peace in the world so that we shouldn't have trouble with Afghanistan and Russia and so on. So he really is thinking of the little people and inflation and trying to make things easier. So what is evil? Now, if your subject is going to be his character, which is indicated by the assignment, then how are you going to handle his political ideas as distinct from his character? You can't just blatantly say, this is evil. You have to make a choice. I'm either going to say something like, his political ideas are bad enough, but that's not my subject. And then it's clear you say, that's not my subject. Or, is there some brief way you could indicate the content of why it's evil without making a big production of that, if you wanted to get it in? How might you conceivably get in a brief indication that his ideas are evil in a paper for an outside audience in which the central subject is his character, not his ideas? Now, it would not be easy to do. But how might you, just in theory, but you couldn't just say, it's evil. But what might you do? Yes?
Stay consistently on the side of extending government power over the individual.
Very good. If you put it simply that much, you could say his political ideas are consistently on the side of extending government power over the individual, violating his rights, restricting his liberties. Now, a liberal who hears that will not be opposed to Kennedy for him having done that, but the liberal will at least grasp there is such a thing as a viewpoint which does not favor the continual expansion of government. And there are people who believe in freedom and rights and so on, and therefore I don't agree and it doesn't convince me, but I get the idea what this person objects to. And a more honest liberal might feel a twinge of thinking, well, that's too bad, but what, you have to do something and save the poor and just brush it aside, but may feel a little qualm. That would be one possibility. In other words, you could stick in an indication. You could even say, I regard as evil the systematic attempt to destroy the middle class in favor of those who don't work for a living. That's a little more extreme, but it gives an idea what you're talking about, or if I can put it in the modern vernacular, where you're coming from, you see. But as it's stated here, it's non-objective because the person has no way to know reading it. What do you mean by evil, and why do you regard him as evil? See, you wouldn't be able to convince in this space, but you should be able to indicate why you say it. On the other hand, for instance, you might be a fervent, let us say, anti-abortionist. And Kennedy's for it. I can't remember, is he for it or the other way around? Whichever it is, because he's liberal and Catholic, so I don't know which way he went. But your reader may think it's on that issue that you think he's evil, and in fact, more likely they would think that because religion has such a monopoly on the terms of good and evil, you see, that they might think you're religious and attacking him because he's not religious. It is non-objective. No, I don't accept that criticism. You say, is it highly insulting to a reader who may accept some of Kennedy's ideas? No. If you took that approach, you couldn't write at all. You could never pass moral judgment because there is nothing which you, to an outside audience, addressed, you remember, to mankind as such, there's nothing which you would legitimately condemn that someone doesn't advocate. And if you were to say, well, I want to concern myself with in effect, the sensibility or the sensitivity of people who might agree with this, you would always be a Republican in it, if you know what I mean. You would be hedging your formulations and saying, well, it seems to me, but of course I understand your viewpoint is not mine, and so on. You have to, objectivity in no way requires you to avoid flat, militant, moral statements. The only point is the person has to know what you mean by them and why you say them. Not exhaustively, but there has to be some indication, you see. And the thing here was there was not even an indication, you see. Now, actually, in doing it, it would be either better to give an indication or simply say, I wouldn't comment on his ideas here. I'll go only to his character, if you want to delimit it that way. One more thing from this I wanted to comment on.
the last part of the last paragraph. Today he's panicking again. He embarrasses himself by saying that neither he nor any of his brothers can be accused of disloyalty. And this means he's thinking and will say anything, including robbing the graves of his dead brothers. Now, there is one non-objectivity in that, which is, again, typical of a rough draft. The student had a definite idea there, but didn't make something clear, and the result is that passage is actually baffling if you don't know the intention of the author. Here's a case where you have to ask the author, what did you mean? Why does saying that I can't be accused of disloyalty, if you remember, Mondale had said he was disloyal because, what did he do? I can't remember. Oh, he attacked the Shah, I think, or whatever. And he said, I can't be accused of disloyalty. Well, why would such a statement mean that he'll say anything to save his image, including robbing the grave of his brothers? On the face of it, what's the connection? Now, what is the writer's actual intention, which I found out by asking him? Because I didn't know. Yes, the intention was to bring in how he always brings up his brothers. In effect, if you say to him on the campaign trail, would you like a Coke? He says, my brothers always wanted Coca-Cola. When one was president, when we had the glorious age of the 60s and so on. And the writer's intention was to show that whatever you say to him, he invokes his brothers. But he didn't say it here. He simply, and by the presentation, there's no stress, there's nothing emphasizing that it's the invoking of his brothers. And the sentence seems to be, he protests that he's loyal, and that makes him a parasite. And it's simply not a clear connection. Now that is the kind of thing which, in reading over your rough draft, you know what's in your mind, but you look at it cold and you say, well, does it follow? Oh, I see, I haven't featured enough that it's the issue that he invokes his brothers. So then I reword it. He embarrasses himself by declaring in answer to Vice President Mondale's accusation, not only that he is disloyal, but he needlessly invokes his brothers to say they weren't either. In other words, you feature, and then you say, if he does that, you don't have to say it that awkwardly, of course, hopefully you could make a better sentence, but you say, if he does that, he's robbing the graves of his brothers. In other words, you just recast it, so the connection becomes clear. Whereas in the rough draft, you just have to blurt it out as it comes to you. If you try to edit it, correct it in the process of writing it, you'd paralyze yourself because you're trying to perfect what isn't there yet. So first, you just have to let it come. You just pour it out. And then you look over it objectively and say, is this clear, and make the adjustments that you need. All right, we will not take up further ones now, but for next week, do the following. And in each case, I want you to just read it and see if you can figure out what is non-objective or rationalistic about it. Do E, F, we've done G, E, F, H, I, J, let's say. I don't know that we'll necessarily get to them all, but we'll do some in any event next week. And we're going to now next week turn to the topic of oral presentation. We've said certain basic theory about written communication and communication as such. We'll turn to oral next time and give you some theory on that. And then on the 5th lecture, we'll begin the presentations from various volunteers. All right, we'll continue next week. We'll have a question period in a few minutes. Thank you. All right, I have a number of written questions that pertain directly to the material, so let me look at them first, or some of them. Could Miss Rand's article have properly been limited to the draft? Yes, I don't see any reason why not. In other words, could it have been just the last half without the earlier discussion of the mixed economy, anti-ideology in Vietnam? Yes, you could simply say, I'm against the draft. That's your subject, your theme. I start with individual rights and go on from there
as she elaborated it. You may have to change some of the wording at the end, which counts on the broader context of anti-ideology, but the substance of the points would stand as a structure, in my opinion. How does your definition of objective communication differ from communication with full context? For example, war is unimportant, only principles count. This would be clear if the full context were provided. Actually, it would not be, because war is unimportant, can't be true in any context. War is a massive destruction of human life, and that cannot be unimportant. What you can say is it's not an important example of something or other, or to oppose war is not of any use if you don't do it by means of principle. But a statement such as war is unimportant, no matter what context you had, would be very misleading. To answer the general question, objective communication is not synonymous with communication with your full context. Objective communication is the broad term standing for communication which actually succeeds, which states something independent of you, the writer, having to fill in. Communication which becomes an entity. Context is merely one of the means of achieving that, and there are others. Concretization is one, structure, so on. So one is the broad equivalent, in effect, of good, and the other is the means of achieving it, or one means. On the Kennedy excerpt, a question about the last sentence, which was his statement about disloyalty, means that he's thinking he will say anything to save his image. Doesn't the last sentence in the Kennedy piece, that would also imply that relying on the memory of his brothers for prestige successfully saves his image? Couldn't it be taken this way if not clarified? I don't think so. You always have to steer a certain course here. You want to make sensitive and subtle distinctions, but you don't want to pick something to death, because nothing will stand if you're determined to find an ambiguity in it. Now, there is such a thing, I've noticed this, and I've read often people who write find this. You edit your things so carefully, so many times, that you begin to change everything. And then the next day you change it back to what you had before, because at a certain point you challenge everything and nothing stays. And when you do that, that means you've oversteered the thing. You're no longer taking it in, and so everything seems unconvincing to you. And as soon as you start finding that you make a change, and then the next time you change it back to the original, you have to go away from it and wait until you get a little distance. So I want to encourage you to find, non-objective formulations, but we can't pick everything apart. Now, this excerpt begins with the statement that he's going to the bottom of America's presidential candidate list because of his deficiencies. Obviously, therefore, the writer does not think that clutching on to his brothers is going to help him. If the writer thought that, he would hardly use such an expression as robbing the graves for the prestige he will never earn, because it clearly implies, I think this is a lousy thing to do. If he thought that this was going to help him save his image, it would imply a real cynicism about the American public, that he would put it in such terms and still think that he was going to do it successfully. And yet he doesn't give anything to suggest that he's anti-American or anti the public. So I don't think you could interpret that. This is a question on the draft. How would you refute a statement on the draft such as Senator Hayakawa's, stating that the handicap should be registered? I never even heard that one. That's yesterday? That's egalitarianism, in other words. Everyone should serve. There should be a wheelchair brigade. Well, I mean, how would I refute that statement? I would not even consider that statement, because it'd be just exactly like if I've just argued against the plague and someone then said to me, well, I know you're against the plague in general, but what about for people who have TB? I'm just as against it. I don't think anybody should be drafted or compulsorily registered. If the question is, should the handicapped be given an opportunity to serve in the army if they want to volunteer, my answer would be they have no right to it. They can't say, I'm an American and therefore I have a right to fight, even if I would be a threat to the rest of the fellow soldiers. On the other hand, that would be up to the generals or the military to decide, not to philosophers. If the handicap is within certain limits and the person is qualified and able to do a necessary job, there's no reason why he should be discriminated against. But certainly not that you have a special right because you're handicapped. Now, a question about Miss Rand's article on the draft. He quotes the sentence from Miss Rand fairly late after showing the essence of altruism. She goes on to say, and he quotes that sentence, whatever country such a principle could apply to, it is not the United States, it's not even Soviet Russia, where they do destroy the minds of their youth, but not in so mawkishly, wantonly senseless a manner. And then the questioner asks, is this an example of bringing up a point there is no time to defend? If not, why not? First of all, is it clear what the point is here that Ms. Rand is making? Why she says they don't do that in Soviet Russia? Obviously, in Soviet Russia, she would hold, does exemplify the philosophy of sacrifice, but not in the form of live your life for bedpans and so on, as the examples of McNamara that she quoted. Their form is sacrifice for your nation or the glory of the world proletariat or whichever. What she particularly objected to in the McNamara proposal was the elevation of the non-value of the sick, the diseased, the weak into a positive value simply because it was lacking in the means to sustain itself. You see, the official Russian ideology is we're serving the workers who are the real creators of value. So to that extent, there's still a certain pretense at justice, but the modern egalitarian viewpoint abandons even the pretense. It's the fact that somebody is undeserving makes them deserving by that fact. It's that she was saying was even worse than in Russia. Now, is this an example of bringing up a point that there was no time to defend? In the sense that she could not go into what she stated in The Age of Envy, her whole view of egalitarianism and why that's the lowest form of altruism and even worse than communism. But no, she would say it's not, because she said, she would say, I'm sure, I haven't asked her this in these words, but I'm sure she would say, you have to have a view of your audience. You can have a view of an audience as ignorant, of not knowing many things, but she would not permit, in her view of the audience she would address, a person who would regard egalitarianism per se as legitimate. You see, she would explain altruism on the grounds of a person may not know what the term means, you have to explain it. But when it takes so or why it's wrong, but when it takes so brazen a form as saying, the healthy should be sacrificed to the sick because they're sick. Let's tear down those who are able because they're able and have them spend their life on changing bedpans, which deserve to be changed only because the person in question can't do it. If he could, he would lose the right to. You see, it's that view which she regards as so profoundly evil that she doesn't consider a person is entitled to come in and say, I don't understand why you're against that. I think that's a legitimate option. You see, she would regard that as beyond the pale. It would be, as she would see it, the equivalent as if you would say, this is even worse than, or this policy X is even worse than being an axe murderer. Now you could say, well, do you have to then go into what's wrong with being an axe murderer? If your audience is such that they do not know what being an axe murderer is and why that's bad, you shouldn't start that subject with them if they have to have that explained.
Now, she is writing to an audience that may not know a great deal, but she will not include in her audience a person who would say, I don't see anything wrong with destroying the good because they're good. Now go and talk to me. She would say, if that's your view, I don't talk to you. You see, so in that sense, in the context of the audience she is writing for, this is not a point that requires clarification. Here's a philosophic question, but more or less on the topic. Why does subjectivism lead to the mind-body dichotomy? And why, if you accept the primacy of existence over consciousness, must you reject the mind-body dichotomy? Now, this is a purely philosophic issue. If you accept the primacy of existence, that means you accept the idea that consciousness, or in this case the human mind, is a faculty for perceiving what's out there. It has no power to change, alter what's out there. It only perceives and then guides your action accordingly. If so, there'll be no basis whatever for a conflict between mind and body, because your mind, if it accepts the primacy of existence, will adhere of its own choice to any facts that it grasps. It won't attempt to fight the facts. There will be then no basis to say there's two realms, the spirit and matter which doesn't obey it, or which is the opposite. On the other hand, take the first half of the question. Why does subjectivism lead to the mind-body dichotomy? And the classic example of this is from Plato, his dialogue, the Timaeus. The idea was, if you believe in subjectivism, that means you believe your mind has the power to alter reality, to wish something and make it come true. In fact, you don't have that power. If you try to practice it, what conclusion will you come to? The realm of matter is simply recalcitrant. It's got, in effect, a mind of its own. It won't do what it's supposed to do. My mind wants something, but the world resists it, doesn't obey. So there's a dilemma, in effect. I say yes, and it should obey, and it doesn't, so I got to choose. Am I going to go with my mind, or am I going to go with reality? And that becomes the mind-body dichotomy. I mentioned Plato because he gave a kind of mythological illustration of this. He was talking about the creation of the world. He believed that the substance of matter always existed, but it was chaotic at one stage. And a kind of big soul came in, a God, and decided to shape the world in the image of the perfect world of forms, to shape matter. And he did his best, this soul, but matter would only take the imprint up to a certain point, and it kept blurring. It was sort of a mythological example that mind could only do so much, and then matter went its own way. And Plato concluded there's an element of evil in matter. It will only take the impress of the mind up to a certain point, and then it resists. It's stubborn. And that's the trouble with the world, that it's made of matter, and that's why we'll only have happiness in the afterworld, which is purely spiritual. Now, that's a kind of cosmic transcript of why, if you try to take the primacy of consciousness, you're going to end up despising matter, and you'll have two realms, mind and body, opposed to each other and in conflict. Remember, dichotomy means clash, conflict, opposition. I'll take a few from the floor before I go back to written, if you have.
I found that one of the things that I have the most trouble with was trying to determine the context of my audience. And I wondered if you could give a few essential things that we might ask ourselves in trying to determine the context. You know, what things need to be explained to the particular audience?
You want me to specify how would you go about determining the context of the audience that you're writing for? Well, we can do this better on particular examples when we hear talks or see papers that are presented to specific audiences. You'll see more clearly how it would work out. For instance, some people are giving a talk to an audience of conservatives and others to an audience of businessmen and so on. And you'll see at that time. But if I were to put it abstractly, the first thing is you have to know who your audience is. Are you writing to people in general or some specific group? If it's a specific group, if it's mankind in general, then there's not much more you can do than simply ask, well, what would a rational mind need to know? beyond taking into account what's generally known today. But if it's a specific group, you have to go more specifically into what can you say? What do you know about them? Either their motivation or their knowledge that is relevant to your presentation. Now, for instance, suppose you're presenting a theory to a business audience of a philosophic topic. What is the first thing that would strike you? If it's a business audience, do you know anything about businessmen today? What's the first thing that you would think of if you ask about your audience? Yeah. They're going to think in one way or the other, oh, this is all hot air. It's all talk. Therefore, I mean, you know that businessmen tend to think that. In a way, not more extreme than other groups tend to. You would know this from experience, if from nothing else. Consequently, you then think, I have to do special work motivating and special emphasis on concretizing to keep it tied down to earth, you see. You have to ask yourself, what would be the dominant ideas or knowledge of this particular view, of this particular group, relevant to my talk? That's all I could say in general terms. Then you give me a specific audience, and I would tell you what kind of things would go through my mind more specifically for a particular talk. But I think you'll see that to some extent in the exercises. Otherwise, ask again after we've had some exercises. Yes, in the red. Would I repeat my definition of what?
Your definition of rationalism as it applies to non-objective.
Would I repeat my definition of rationalism as it applies to non-objective formulations? Well, I never did do that, but to do it briefly, rationalism, we said last time, is effectively deduction divorced from reality. It's treating ideas as a self-contained world and then just deducing one from the other, letting the whole thing float free of reality. Why do I include that then in exercises on non-objectivity, or how is that non-objective? Objective, remember, is that the thing has been turned out by you to such an extent in correspondence with the reality, you were, that the thing in itself is self-containedly self-intelligible. It stands on its own and doesn't require you to put any elaboration in. Rationalism is the opposite of this. It's a subjective construct. You start arbitrarily based on your feelings. You float free of reality and you make up a whole little dimension. Well, anybody in your audience can look at it and say, why? Why start there? Why believe all this stuff? What has it got to do with reality? So it's the most extreme example of something cut off from reality, because it's not just any given formulation that's undefended or that's vague or misleading. The entire thing floats in another dimension, and therefore it has no connection to reality and it completely doesn't stand by itself. In that sense, it's an extreme example of non-objectivity. This is a question on metaphysics. If I heard you correctly, you stated that the universe is not eternal, since eternity would imply an infinity of time, which is impossible. No, you did not hear correctly. I stated that the universe is not infinite, but that it was eternal. This was last week, I believe. Eternal does not mean infinite. It means out of time. It means it does not belong in time. Therefore, you cannot ask how long it lasted. It simply is timeless. But obviously, it's there, and it's not leaving. So, because I say that because the question goes on, do I believe that the universe will eventually cease to exist? No. On this point, I agree entirely with Parmenides, the ancient Greek philosopher. What is, and it is. And there's no point at which you will ever be able to say it isn't. What is not, and never will be, nor be conceived of. He had it a little better, but that was his basic idea. Somebody else from the floor. Yes?
I'm wondering something that I observed last week was an example of non-objectivity. In a play, before the play began, one of the characters came
Let me repeat that. The lady went to a play, and before it started, the author came on stage, or somebody came on stage. One of the characters came on stage and told the audience what they were going to feel, and then proceeded, when they watched the play, and then proceeded to enact it. Is that an example of non-objectivity in the sense that the author is still needed? Oh, certainly that, plus many other things. But yes, absolutely, because the work does not then stand by itself. Now, you see, there's a somewhat different application because it's fiction. But still, if he wants to communicate a certain feeling or mood or whichever, he has to give you the concretes and recreate the actual reality of it. To come in and say, oh, this isn't enough, this is what I want you to feel, would be exactly the equivalent in art as though in literature we wrote the piece and you said, by the way, I don't mean the things I said up there, I want to add in such and such, otherwise you're going to misinterpret it, then the piece is not an objective presentation. I say that's much worse because that's an actual destruction of the art form. When the author starts giving you messages, that would be the equivalent of a painting, you know, with an essay attached to it underneath. So that is modern nihilism, which is even worse than non-objectivity, but it certainly would be non-objectivity. Yes?
Doesn't Shakespeare do that, however, in some of his plays?
Not that I know. Does Shakespeare do it? Not that I know.
And then parenthetically says something about the play.
He has some asides, but I don't know any case in Shakespeare where he would dream of doing, I'm not a great admirer of Shakespeare, but I don't know any case where he would dream of doing what they do in the Performing Garage in New York. A written question. Do you think Ms. Rand repeatedly uses as a technique words such as the single, the worst, the fundamental, the main, the real, the only, as a method of self-containment to keep the reader focused on primary issues and arguments? No. Certainly I would say not, because you cannot use words which are a specific concept with specific meanings for some purpose ulterior to or other than the content of the words. You can't say, well, I said this is the only virtue, not because it really is the only virtue, but because I don't want to cover any other issues. In other words, I'll make a falsehood, but I'll do it because I want to be self-contained. Absolutely not. She would not say the only unless she thinks the only is the truth, and the same for all these other words. The reason, if you think she uses words of that kind, is because she's always focused on essentials. So suppose there are 12 aspects to the question, she will say the vital aspect or the crucial or whichever is, because that's the aspect she's focused on. But this idea in the question is not correct. Suppose I were asked to give a talk on the draft to an uninitiated audience. Since Ms. Rand has done such an excellent job, would it be legitimate to read her article? To the audience after identifying it as hers? Yes, certainly that would be legitimate. Anything in print you can read if you give credit. The only question is this: how much time do you have? What is your audience's context? What year is it? It might not be appropriate to give Hershey and McNamara to a young audience that doesn't remember it when you could give Secretary Vance or whoever the latest equivalents of it are. Perhaps there's too many issues in that article and you want to make it simpler for your audience. It all depends. So the fact that this is an excellent piece on the draft doesn't mean that in every context for every audience the best thing to do is read this aloud. It's lengthy, it's complex, there's an awful lot of points and aspects, and it's philosophical. You have to decide. But assuming it were appropriate, it's always right to read aloud from something that you give the credit for. Now, I have some questions here that were not by any means directly on the material tonight. But before I look at them, I'll take any other questions from the floor. Okay, well, here's a few. This is on science. What is the, Ms. Rand has stated that she would like to solve the problem of induction. What is the essence of this problem? Why is it a problem? In essence, the problem of induction is how do you know when you're entitled to generalize? How do you know when you can form a universal statement? All so-and-so is true. It's true in every case from simply an observation of selected instances. You see this man die and this man and this man, and after a while you say, all men are mortal. On the other hand, you see this puppy dog wag its tail when it's happy and this one, but you hesitate to say all puppy dogs wag their tails when happy. Now, what is the criteria and the method by which you know when you can generalize and when you can't, and how do you decide? That's, in essence, the problem, and it's a problem simply because many leads have been offered, but a full-fledged discussion would have to take into account the nature of concepts, because as Ms. Rand points out, induction is very similar to concept formation, and you'd have to apply a proper theory of concepts to this realm, which has not been done. Now, the second question of this: what is the objectivist position with respect to the concepts of motion and change? Are they eternal, i.e. metaphysical primaries? If they are not regarded as given, would that lead to an infinite regress of antecedent changes or motions? Well, this question verges on physics. All you could say about it from a philosophic point of view is you cannot derive motion from non-motion. If you attempted to do that, the only way to do it would be Aristotle. That was his argument for God, if you know the argument of the prime mover. If you try to explain the fact of motion as such without assuming it, then you'd have to derive it from the non-moving. And Aristotle couldn't think of any conceivable way, and nor could I, of how you would derive motion from the non-moving except via the world falling in love with a stationary God. And that's what, according to him, the world falling in love made the world go round, and that's what caused motion. But objectivism would not go into science. All we would say is you do have to take motion as a primary. Now, whether physicists could show something inherent in matter which necessitates motion, so that in that sense it's not a primary but explicable, that's a question philosophy would have no view on. Now, here's one farther removed from the course. How would the rules of journalism, well, maybe not farther, how would the rules of journalism apply to objective communication? In a piece of reporting, a reporter must include the following: who, what, where, when, why, and how. Well, obviously, a journalist should communicate objectively, but in a very general way, the things we're covering in this course would apply to a journalist. His statement should be objective, so on. But this course is actually more applicable to writing the editorials than the news stories, because I'm not here concerned with how you organize or acquire factual data, but how you present ideas, including your evaluations of what's going on, how you discuss ideas, philosophic ideas and assessments of things. So, although there's a broad connection between communication and every form, including journalism, science writing, and so on, the tie-in here is much more to editorials. And let's make this the last question for tonight. You mentioned that if one followed all the FDA rules and regulations, you would only drink orange juice in a darkened room. On a similar line of questioning, how can one fight and exist in business against the increasing number of rules which are regulating business out of existence? Well, that's obviously a political question. As two different questions. How can you fight in business, and how can you exist in business? How can you exist in business is very hard today. That I certainly grant. You have to do what you can. I think it's possible in some lines still to exist, but it is very hard in some fields and growing harder in all. Which brings me to the more important one, or at least the one I can answer. How can you fight in business? And the answer is the same way as anybody else. by propagating the right ideas. That's the only way you can do it. You can't do it by dealing with the bureaucrats directly, or, I mean, you may have to deal with them in business, but you're not going to change the country or get in a better situation by making special deals with them. The only way is philosophic education of whomever you come in contact with to whatever extent you're able to. And that's why the material in this course is applicable to you as a businessman as well as to in any other capacity. I wish I had a more specific answer, but it's a philosophy that got us where we are, and that's the only thing that's going to get us out. On that note, we'll conclude for this evening.